My first tennis memory? People always ask about it, but I'm afraid I don't have one. I just remember playing all the time. It's like tennis was always there, like going to services at Kingdom Hall Church, like breathing. I saw a picture once of Venus pushing me in a stroller on a tennis court, but I don't actually remember this moment. I've seen pictures of me holding a racket taken around the time I started to walk. I don't remember those either. Best anyone can recall, I was 3 years old. That is early specialization, and this is an excerpt from the book we're going to talk about today, On the Line by Serena Williams and Daniel Paisner.
Welcome to Performers, the podcast that takes you into the minds of the world's most extraordinary athletes, coaches, and performers. We're your hosts. I'm Dr. Greg Young, and you've just heard from Dr. Duncan Simpson. As sports psychology experts, we'll guide you through the pages of their autobiographies, revealing the mindsets, strategies, and habits that propelled the world's best to the pinnacle of their fields. Our goal is to help you learn from history's greatest performers. For each episode, we read and then condense entire autobiographies into concentrated insights, representing over 20 hours of work per episode. You gain not only the collective wisdom of these elite performers, but also access to over 30 years of our professional expertise in sports psychology. So listening to this, you're saving countless hours while accessing the distilled wisdom and proven strategies of the best in their fields. Duncan, Serena Williams is probably one of the most famous athletes on the planet and is also one of the most recognizable people on the planet.
Well, she has a lot of accomplishments, so here we go. She won 23 Grand Slam singles titles, which is the most in the Open era, just one behind Margaret Court's all-time record. In doubles, alongside her sister Venus, she claimed 14 Grand Slam titles, remaining undefeated in major doubles finals, which also makes her second all-time behind Martina Navratilova, who won an incredible 31 Grand Slam doubles titles. That didn't make sense to me when I looked it up, but apparently it's correct. Serena is a four-time Olympic gold medalist, winning singles once and doubles 3 times. She's the only player to have achieved the career Golden Slam in both singles and doubles, which means that she won all 4 Grand Slam titles and an Olympic gold in each category. At her peak, she was world number 1 for a total of 319 weeks, which is just over 6 years, finishing the year-end number 1 5 separate times. In total, she won 73 WTA Tour singles titles and 23 doubles titles, really solidifying her dominance in the sport. Off-court achievements, Serena is a powerhouse entrepreneur. Her investment firm, Serena Ventures, has backed over 85 companies, including major brands like Impossible Foods and Masterclass. She's the co-owner of multiple sports teams, including the Miami Dolphins, Angel City FC, and the Los Angeles Golf Club. Most recently, she became a co-owner of the Toronto Tempo, which is the first Canadian WNBA franchise, which is debuting in 2026. She's a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. She has led vocal advocacy for gender equality in sports. Beyond business and activism, Serena has left a mark on fashion and entertainment, launching her own clothing line and appearing in television and films. So Serena's influence stretches far beyond tennis. She's an icon, Greg, in business, philanthropy, and really cultural leadership. Few athletes in any sport have built a legacy quite like hers.
And that's all we've got time for this week on Performers. That's a crazy, crazy list. Tell us a little bit about the book.
So the book was published in 2009 when Serena was 27. So it's fair to say that a lot has happened in the last 15 years. However, today we're really going to focus on her upbringing and what we'd probably say is the first half of her pro career. To our knowledge, she hasn't released another autobiography, but apparently she has signed a book deal to do so. So watch this space.
She's heard about Performers and she wants to get it reviewed and stuck on here. I hear that's the motivation behind it. You know the circles I move in.
Absolutely. She's ready to be on Performers. So are you ready to dive in?
I am. Let's go for it.
My parents taught themselves the game so they could teach it to us. It's one of the first things people mention when they talk about my career or Venus's. And yet, for some reason, it's not always seen as a positive. I don't get that, because there's nothing wrong with learning about something and passing it on to your children. Yes, it was a calculated move. So, Greg, the story goes that her dad was watching the French Open in 1978, and he couldn't believe that the prize money for winning the French Open was $40,000. And at the time, that was more than her dad earned in the entire year. And to continue, Serena says, he came home and said to my mother, we need to make 2 more kids and make them into tennis superstars. Now tell me, what's wrong with that? Coming upon some rewarding new path your kids might follow and pointing them in the right direction? Doesn't seem to me there's anything to criticize here, but people are certainly quick to criticize, don't you think? And there's been some resentment layered onto it as well. Because for whatever reason, there's this notion that if you didn't grow up around the game, if it wasn't in your blood to begin with, you had no real claim to it. Tennis is like that, I'm afraid. There's a sense of entitlement, of belonging, like you have to be born into it. Like you have to have played it at a high level before you can teach it. For the longest time, it was this sense of entitlement that probably kept a whole group of potentially talented minorities and underprivileged kids from taking up the game. It must have felt to them like it was a sport of advantage, and I guess it was. So Greg, I'm going to start with a big question. I know you like these. Do you see anything wrong with what her parents were doing, especially her dad?
Honestly, I don't see anything wrong with what our parents did at all. The fact that they weren't necessarily from tennis doesn't change the fact that they were willing to put in the work to learn the game and teach it to their daughters. To me, it's a perfect example of how drive and vision and creativity can create opportunities where perhaps there are non-obvious ones. A lot of people criticize the idea of maybe forcing, that's a really strong word, but forcing kids into something. But from the way that Serena describes it, this was more about creating that pathway and giving them a fighting chance, not about imposing the dream from the parents' side. And I think what's often missed is the depth of intention. As you've said before, stop asking people for directions to places that they've never been. And I really like that. So these obviously so-called tennis experts have never made 2 female champions before because it's never been done. So our dad wasn't just trying to make tennis champions, he was trying to give them the tools to rise above the circumstances of Compton, the place where they were born and raised. And I guess to the critics of Richard Williams, to King Richard as it were, what if he hadn't done this? What might have happened to his family in Compton if he didn't have this grand plan?
Yeah, so many great points there, Greg, and it actually leads perfectly into this section, which perhaps uncovers why her dad was so driven. And she said, he pushed us to the very top levels of the game. People in tennis seem to either admire this about him or to resent him for it. But my dad saw tennis as a way to open doors for his daughters, probably thinking the more doors that were opened for us, the better. So he ordered some instructional books and videos and taught himself the game. His idea was to kind of make it up as he went along. He'd do his homework, borrow what he liked from this coach or that, and find a way to pass it on to his daughters. He was a quick study. He always said he had a master plan for us and that he was the master planner. And part of the plan was to collect whatever tennis insights he could find. He moved about by touch and feel. He added to our game plan by borrowing from the game plans of others. Mostly he watched local pros, picked up ideas and strategies for his sessions with us.
I love this, Duncan. I've heard it said before that observation is acceptable theft, and I think that's what his tactics or his strategy is here. And when you dig into that, it really makes sense why he was so relentless. The saying goes, "I've never seen a strong person with an easy past." It's not just about teaching tennis here; it's about creating a way out of that hardship that he personally had experienced in his upbringing, and he knew how difficult life could be. So his drive was about breaking generational cycles of oppression and giving his daughters an opportunity that wasn't available to them and probably wasn't available to him at his time as well. So tennis was a tool, and you talked about that as a way to open doors that may have otherwise stayed closed. What's fascinating is how he wasn't afraid to really create his own path here. He didn't let the fact that he knew nothing about tennis hold himself back. So the criticism that he received wasn't necessarily about the success, because that's clearly undeniable. The history books don't lie there. It's perhaps a little bit about the unconventional methods in order to get there. So when we talk about unconventional, this made me think of our last episode with Tony Hawk, and I said some very profound things in there, but I wanted to go back to the episode, and I said something along the lines of success doesn't always equal acceptance. So what's the real lesson here? Innovation often comes with resistance. So when you do something differently, whether that's sports, business, or any field, you're going to face pushback. You're going to face that resistance. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing here.
Yeah, Greg, that's just a great connection back to episode 33 with Tony Hawk. So if you haven't listened, go back, listen to that last episode. And Serena continues, absolutely, Daddy believed tennis was our ticket up and out of Compton, the rough and tumble neighborhood in Los Angeles where we lived, but he also knew we had what it took. He knew it wasn't enough to simply teach us the game and train us to be champions. If that's all it took, then everyone would be doing it. We had to have some God-given talent and athletic ability. We had to develop a passion for the game and an iron will to succeed. And all these things would take time presenting themselves.
Duncan, you want to talk about purpose? Talk to a dad who's trying to protect 5 daughters.
You're so right, and I don't think it's a stretch too far to say it's a life and death situation, actually, as we'll hear about later. But it also wasn't just about his dad's dream. And she says,
Look at you teasing the audience.
I know, hey, cliffhangers.
You're learning the trade here.
So, at first, tennis was just something to do, a way for us to be together as a family. Don't get me wrong, tennis became a real focus for us very quickly. It became Daddy's focus, certainly. But what a lot of people don't realize is Mom was with him every step of the way. This was her deal too. It wasn't just that she supported Dad's vision. She saw what he saw. She wanted what he wanted, and she worked for it just as much as he did. She had her ideas on how we should train, and even now, she's one of the best at helping break down my game and figure out what's working and what's not. Say what you want about my dad, and folks have said an awful lot over the years. He had a gentle demeanor when he wanted to, especially when we were just starting out. He made a game out of it, encouraging me to swing as hard as I could. Didn't matter to him where I hit it or how I hit it, just that I hit it. That regulation racket was probably bigger than I was, but we couldn't afford a junior racket. Over the years, I've wondered if that was some kind of stamp on the way I played, taking my very first swings with a racket that was too big for me. Maybe that was the first instance of my dad setting things up so that success was something I had to reach for. It might have been there for the taking, but I would have to rise to meet the challenge. Greg, there's a real richness in these opening sections about their background, and I think the dad's involvement is somewhat well known, especially given the movie King Richard, as you alluded to, with Will Smith, who won an Oscar for depicting Richard Williams. But I guess we didn't know too much about the mum's involvement.
Great opportunity here for me, Duncan, to plug episode 32 with Will Smith. And although that episode doesn't talk about the movie King Richard because it wasn't out yet, go back and have a listen. Serena's mom doesn't always get the spotlight, but it's clear that she was just as invested as Serena's dad. And that's such an important part of the story. People often talk about Richard Williams, and rightfully so. He had this huge vision for his daughters. But what is interesting here is how both parents were completely aligned in their mission. And that's something that people might not always recognize. I also think the part about the oversized racket, it sort of serves as a bit of a metaphor here, and quite a powerful one, for how Serena's early challenges shaped her into the athlete that she was eventually going to become. It wasn't just a physical obstacle. Of course, it was a physical obstacle, but it was also a lesson in overcoming adversity. That early struggle with the racket, that's just the beginning of a lifelong journey where success is never just handed to you. It has to be fought for, you've got to adapt towards it, and you have to earn it.
So let's hear about some of those adversities early on and really humble beginnings. And she says, the courts themselves were in sorry shape. There was broken glass everywhere, cracks in the cement, weeds poking through, soda cans, beer bottles, fast food wrappers. I've read articles that said there was drug paraphernalia littering the courts and that we girls had to sweep up the syringes, tubes and plastic bags out of the way before we could play. But I don't remember any of that. In other articles, it says that we could hear gunshots ringing out while we were playing, all from drive-by shootings. That I remember full well. Only the shots themselves didn't sound all that terrifying until I learned what they were. Over time, Daddy collected all this equipment, ball hoppers, carts, cones, whatever he could find to make our sessions more like the ones in his books and videos. He really tried to create a professional environment for us on a nothing budget. Man, those balls were precious to us. They were like money in the bank. I don't recall that we ever retired a ball from our collection. Daddy would take the oldest, boldest, flattest balls and turn them into a drill. He'd keep them in the mix with all the other balls, but when he pitched one of those special balls to us, he would say it would help with our speed, our footwork, and our concentration. I hated getting after those balls. They just wouldn't bounce, but Daddy kept them in. At Wimbledon, he says, those balls will bounce slow. Just like these special balls, you just have to be ready. Greg, we've heard from several of our performers who came from really humble beginnings. I think Pat Summitt, Mike Tyson, Alex Ferguson, Pele, Jackie Robinson, Simone Biles, Lance Armstrong, Sugar Ray Leonard. So, what's the takeaway for listeners, whether they're in a tough situation or they come from more fortunate backgrounds?
We've mentioned this before, but it is important to emphasize again that poverty itself isn't something to necessarily glorify. Statistically, it often leads to a cascade of challenges that makes success a real steep uphill climb, almost like it's ice skating uphill. But here's where it gets nuanced. It's not poverty that determines your future. It's how you respond to it. I know that sounds a little bit like a throwaway comment, and there's a lot of things that need to align here, but that kind of is the key if you have the means to do so. And that's the key in Serena's story. What's remarkable is how her family, despite having so little, found a way to make things work. They were creative, they were resourceful, and probably most importantly, they were relentless. But we need to recognize that not everyone has the same opportunities, the same resilience, or the same family support. So this idea of, the phrase pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, it's often oversimplified and sometimes often over glorified as well. It assumes that everyone has the same starting point and that the hard work that you have alone can overcome systemic barriers. And that just isn't the reality for many, many, many people.
Greg, you're right. I love that kind of nuance there. Sure, people have agency and they make some decisions, and of course, actions matter. But life isn't just about willpower and determination, as you said. There are countless variables: family dynamics, access to resources, social and economic factors, and as we've heard, pure luck and timing that sometimes shapes people's abilities to succeed. I think everyone's story is different, and the path to achievement is often shaped by things that are far beyond our personal control. Hence the purpose of this podcast, right? To learn from history's greatest performers. So I'll get off my soapbox for a minute and on with the story. So tennis starts out just as fun for Serena and her sisters, but by the time Serena's kind of 5 or 6, she doesn't quite know, and Venus is 6 or 7, they're playing about 3 or 4 hours a day, every week. And she says, it got to be a grueling schedule, but none of us really minded it, or we hardly noticed it. We were all together. It was just what we did, that's all. We didn't know any different. We didn't have a whole lot of friends outside of school. There was only time for each other for tennis. My dad tried to make it fun for us. Every session had a theme, a structure. He'd set up all these creative games with cones placed around the court, and there'd be a series of challenges we'd have to meet. Sometimes he'd set up little messages or sayings on the fence around the court to help motivate us, and maybe just to make us smile. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Believe. You are a winner. Be humble. Say thank you. He'd write out these empowering messages on big pieces of paper or oak tag, and sometimes he'd have us write them out. Then he'd hang them up around the court. If there was a theme for one of these sessions, like focus, all the messages would have to do with the same theme. He really put a lot of time and effort into this part of training because he believed it was important. He wanted these messages to resonate, for the visual image of the word to linger in our minds after we left the court. So Greg, there's probably things you absolutely love here, and there's maybe a few things that made you cringe a little.
Yeah, there are a few there. It's a mixed bag, isn't it? On the one hand, I love how Serena's dad made the training environment so engaging. I think this is pretty low-hanging fruit and it has a massive return on investment, but is often overlooked. I love the focus on creativity, fun, positive messages around the court. These are all really, really strong ways to reinforce a growth mindset and continue to build confidence. Remember, we're talking about young girls. There's one. Young underprivileged girls, that's 2. Young underprivileged girls in an environment where they're probably not getting that confidence built from other areas. So that's a great 3. And it's clear how he's very intentional about embedding these ideas into their training. And as we've said before, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults. Now, on the other side of things, the part that stands out to me is the lack of a social life outside of the family, particularly at such a young age. Serena and Venus didn't really have time for anything else outside of that little tennis bubble that they've got. And that's sort of where I start to cringe. Of course, they didn't know any better. And if my math is correct, which it very, very rarely is, I think 4 hours a day, 7 days a week is 28 hours. That's a massive amount of training for anybody, but especially for kids, 5, 7 years old. So while dedication and hard work, they're absolutely crucial, there is a fine line here between commitment and moving towards that idea of burnout.
Did you just do public math?
I did simple public math.
You're a brave man. Well, we know there's definite dangers with burnout and injury with that kind of load, and it's hard to put what I'd say is the right number of training hours. large training volume is just an inescapable part of elite performers' journeys. And I believe, when I was thinking back to this, I think Simone Biles was up at 36 hours a week of training when she was around 11 or 12, which is in episode 20. This amount of volume has to be managed effectively. And okay, with all of these training hours, one concept that comes to mind is discipline. And she said, I was the youngest of five sisters. There was me at the bottom, then Venus, 15 months ahead of me. My parents established the tone in our house, but you could say the girls held sway. My parents were disciplinarians, but on top of that, we were taught to be self-disciplined. My older sisters used to say me and V had it easy, because by the time my parents got to us, they were too tired or worn out to be super strict disciplinarians, but I don't know about that. They were still pretty hard on us, but we were even harder on ourselves. We were expected to do our schoolwork and our chores and help each other out in what other ways were age appropriate.
Duncan, this really highlights an interesting dynamic for me, the balance between external discipline and internal drive. It's one thing to be told what to do, but it's another thing to develop that ability to push yourself and hold yourself accountable. And that's the big lesson right here. A lot of successful people have that ability to hold themselves to that high standard, even when no one else is pushing them. And as you said in a previous episode, hard work works.
Yeah, some excellent points. And I think just to really wrap up this section, Serena says it all goes to character, the way you're raised, where you're raised, how you look out at the world, how the world looks back at you. All of that gets mix mastered together in such a way that you come out the other side a fully formed person. Only it took me a good long time before I got my game on in this respect. Fully formed? That wasn't me. Not until I was much, much older. I took shape at my own pace. For a while, I had a real princess type mindset. Maybe it came from being the youngest. Maybe it came from smiling my way into a different sister's good graces each night. Maybe it came from learning to get what I wanted. Maybe I was just spoiled, plain and simple. My sisters took care of me, that's for sure, and I was pretty good at playing one off against another to get what I wanted.
Duncan, this is a powerful reminder that personal growth isn't a race. It doesn't happen on anyone else's timeline but your own. So Serena's journey shows that development, especially character development. That is a process that takes time, and it's not really one that you can rush. It's not about having it all figured out early on. It's about reflecting and adapting and evolving at your own pace and truly figuring out who you are. I think this is a crucial lesson for anyone. Growth is really, really messy, but it's through that process that you really do shape who you become.
And of course, Serena's character and career was heavily shaped by one other person in particular. And she says, 1 year, 3 months, 9 days, that's the age difference between me and my older sister Venus. These days, it doesn't seem like much, but when we were kids, it felt like I'd never fill the gap. She cast a big shadow, I'll say that. She was taller, prettier, quicker, and more athletic, and she was certainly nicer. There was no living up to her. I certainly tried. I wanted to do everything just like Venus. I still remember this one national newspaper article about Venus that suggested that I'd never be anything more than a footnote in Venus's career. It talked about how in tennis the younger sibling never amounts to much, and how that would be my fate too. I promised myself I'd never forget that article, that one day I'd prove the reporter wrong. It was such a cruel thing to say, but I turned it into some more of that silent fuel. I filed it away for later. Growing up on those tennis courts in Compton and in Linwood and all over Los Angeles, it sometimes felt like nobody believed in me. I suppose I understood it on some level. Clearly Venus was the phenom, the prodigy, the rising star, but on another level it hurt. Even my dad, who's always been my biggest supporter, was spending more time with Venus, more time on her game, more time talking to reporters and coaches about her. The more he talked to people about us, the more he took us out to these events, the more connections he made in the game, the more it became about Venus. Greg, there's a lot in there. So what do you pull out of this section about Venus and Serena's relationship?
That's very true. There is a lot to unpack here. I think the thing that stands out to me the most here is maybe the emotional journey of being the younger sibling, especially when you're constantly living in the shadow of someone who's clearly seen as a prodigy here. The newspaper article calling her a footnote to Venus's career, man, that's a really powerful moment. That kind of hit me a little bit when you read that out. it could have broken her spirit, but instead it became fuel, right? She's added it to the file. She's filed it away. Bigger picture, Serena's story reminds us that success isn't about the physical work. Well, isn't all about the physical work. Certainly not just against external competitors, but also within that family dynamic that she's got going on. Obviously, being one of 5 sisters, but one of 2 tennis prodigies. So this theme of proving yourself, which she probably has to do time and time again, being the younger sibling, finding your own voice, finding your own path, I think it's something that all of us, even if you're not a younger sibling, can actually relate to.
There's a real paradox in Serena's relationship with Venus. On one hand, she deeply admires and looks up to her older sister. She almost worships her as a role model, and she can't say enough good things about Venus in the book. But beneath that kind of admiration really lies this fierce sibling rivalry and an underdog story that drives Serena. And I think it's quite one-sided. It's not really reciprocated from Venus. It's really driving Serena. And there's a nice section here, and she says, during the 2008 US Open, a reporter asked me an interesting question. She asked me how many more majors I might have won if Venus had not loomed in my path on so many occasions. It was a reasonable question. Venus had knocked me out from a major on 5 different occasions, twice in finals. So just going by the numbers, I could see where the reporter was going with this line of thought. But I went another way in my response. Without hesitating, I said, I don't think I would have won nearly as many. This wasn't exactly what the reporter was expecting to hear, so I talked about how growing up in Venus's shadow had been such a positive motivator for me, how the impossible standards she set on the court and off was such a powerful model, how she pushed me to be the very best I could be. Without V to lead the way, it would have taken me longer to get to where I wanted to be. And then, once I started to have some success on my own, I still looked to Venus. If she won a major, it fired me up to win the next one. If she went out early to practice on a morning after a big win, I went out early to practice. Really, I don't know where I'd get that drive were it not for Venus. I suppose I would have found it somewhere, and it might have taken a little while. Yes, you look at the scoreboard and you see that Venus beat me a bunch of times in Grand Slam tournaments. She beat me twice in finals, at Wimbledon in 2008 and at the US Open in 2001. So right there, I might have had 2 more titles. But I don't see it that way. The way I see it, who knows if I would have even made it that far without Venus. Greg, I simply love this response from Serena. I don't think I'd have won nearly as many.
I'm making an assumption here, Duncan, that Venus was Serena's doubles partner.
Yeah, she was.
Yeah, so she definitely wouldn't have won nearly as many.
You're right about that.
Yeah, I do love the response though, and I do think it is quite profound. That rivalry can be a driving force, and it also can be a catalyst for growth because you have to grow to be able to overcome it. So living in someone's shadow can be, at times really painful and frustrating, particularly when it's so close to home. And she acknowledges this, but it ultimately doesn't become resentment. And she uses it for, as she talks about, fuel for her success. So she recognizes that Venus's success sets the standard that really helps her to push her and elevate her game. Based on my memory, I don't think we've covered any sibling rivalries so far. Many of our performers have had rivals that have pushed them to become better. I remember we talked a lot about how Pat Summitt's Lady Vols basketball team and Gino Auriemma's UConn team pushed each other to new heights and continued to raise the bar for each other. And just as Sampras pushed Agassi and Ian Thorpe pushed Michael Phelps, Tommy the Hitman Hearn pushed Sugar Ray Leonard as well.
Yeah, some great examples of rivalry there, but you're right. I don't think we've talked about sibling rivalry, and I'm not sure there's too many that will come up, but we'll see. So when Serena is 9, her parents want to move the family to Florida. They believe that there's more opportunities for them. Serena is the youngest of 5 sisters, and some of her older sisters were not happy with the move. And she says, Tunde would stay behind in Los Angeles. The rest of us would drive to Florida and start in a new house, a new school, and a new everything. Years later, my parents told me Compton itself was part of the problem. I didn't recognize their concerns at the time, but apparently there was a lot of gang-related violence and drug use and racial tensions. There were those gunshots ringing out while we played. We were protected from a lot of it as kids because we were always together, always playing tennis, but that didn't mean it wasn't a problem. Tunde and Isha were starting to notice it as they moved around town on their own. Some of their friends were in and out of trouble. People were struggling to get by and scrambling to stay safe, and after a while, I guess it started to play into my parents' thinking. they didn't want us to grow up in such an uncertain environment for any longer than we had to.
And let me jump in here. Moving to Florida wasn't just about tennis, it was clearly about providing a safer, more stable environment for their family.
You're right, it is more than about tennis. And I think tennis just provided the means to keep the family safe. And again, I think it's a good decision when we reflect back on it. So they moved to Florida. They're exploring different opportunities. They explore Nick Bollettieri's academy in Bradenton, Florida, which of course is where Andre Agassi moved when he was 13. And you can hear all about that way back in episode 1. We're plugging lots of episodes tonight.
Way back in episode 1. We apologise for the sound again.
Yeah. Serena really liked the Bollettieri Tennis Academy, but they ended up in Greenleaf, which was run by a pro named Rick Massey, which is actually covered pretty extensively in King Richard. However, their dad still remained their main coach. That was never going to be in question, even though they're at Rick Massey's academy. The girls had accelerated school to help cram everything into their day. So there was school in the morning, followed by tennis all afternoon every day. And at Greenleaf, there was really this intense focus on fitness training, including hill running, strength work, and conditioning, which Serena was not a fan of. It was quite the transition from what her dad was doing with them. Additionally, Serena's tennis training in Florida brought two key changes. First, she primarily practiced with boys, which was actually viewed as unconventional at the time, believe it or not. And secondly, she spent more one-on-one time training with her father as Venus started to work with separate coaches. And this gave her a really unique opportunity to develop under his direct guidance. They also decided to keep Venus and Serena off the junior tennis circuit. And she says, people in tennis seem to like it when things go a certain way. And there was this tall, proud black man from California who never played tennis himself, raising up a real prospect and her kid sister, who might just turn out to be a real prospect as well, and going against the way things were done. He seemed to be thumbing his nose at the tennis establishment, but of course it wasn't like that. Anyone who took the time to talk to Daddy could see that, but it became too easy for people to seize on these negative first impressions and let them take hold. But Daddy just thought we didn't need the pressures of the junior tournament circuit, and he was right about that. He didn't like the way parents and coaches were all over the junior players, bouncing around from tournament to tournament. He wanted us to have a normal life. He didn't want to be one of those parents pushing his kids down a path they might not necessarily have chosen for themselves. Plus, he thought he could get better competition just hitting with these pros and coaches and working on our fundamentals. I've always thought this was a genius move, ever since I was old enough to fully realize how things went, but Daddy just shrugs it off. He makes it sound like it was a happy accident that things worked out this way. He says, Mika, there wasn't any point in traveling all around the country to watch you and V beat up on those little girls. So, Greg, there actually seems to be a bit of a contradiction here from Serena. She says her dad's wanted a normal life, but as we've discussed, kind of 20 plus hours a week of training with very little social life isn't normal. You can have it all, but you can't have it all at once, as we've said before.
Yeah, moving to Florida to play tennis against boys and be trained massively intensively, that sounds very much like a normal life, doesn't it? It really is an interesting contradiction here. And I think one that speaks to the really complex nature of Serena's upbringing. It's almost like they were trying to give their daughters the best of both worlds, right? An opportunity for success without burning them out too early. But as we've seen, that is a really, really tricky balance. And it's clear while Serena recognizes the value in her dad's approach, she does also realize the sacrifices that come along with it. And I have to say overall that Serena is extremely complimentary about her parents and how her childhood, unlike someone like Andre Agassi, again in episode 1, who followed a similar, very, very similar trajectory, was coached by his dad, was a tennis phenom, prodigy, moved to Florida, etc., etc. Agassi did, however, play the junior circuit and was very much pressured by his dad to win, and therefore made guilty for spending family money on tournament travel and fees and all of those things when he didn't necessarily win. So it really did come with a ton of baggage for Agassi, which it doesn't feel like it comes with for Serena and Venus.
Yeah, that is a great comparison. And in fairness, we should take Serena's experience on face value. And overall, it seems pretty positive. So she says, it kept us from burning out of tennis at an early age, and it allowed us to develop our games in exciting new ways. And it helped to build up all this anticipation about how we might finally perform once we started competing, which of course got people talking about us in and around tennis. But that was just how it worked out, I guess. Absolutely, Dad had a kind of master plan, but here he was just going by sense and feel and making it up as he went along.
There's some absolute marketing genius in there. 101, create scarcity. Don't let them play in everything so everyone wants to see it when it happens.
Great point. A lot of times when people hear how I grew up and how much time and focus we spent on tennis, they ask me if I ever felt any pressure. I tell them no, and they're always surprised by my answer, but that's the truth. Really, there was never any pressure placed on me, not by my parents and not by any of the other coaches. In fact, I went through a period where I really didn't want to play at all and nobody pushed me. For my parents, if I never made it as a tennis player, they'd be proud and happy for me as long as I was doing something that made me proud and happy. If I'd just gone to college and played tennis there, they would have been fine. Even if I stopped playing altogether, that would have been fine. They only wanted to give us this giant opportunity. After that, it was up to us to make of it what we wanted. Greg, anything different to add?
I think one small note is the lack of parental pressure here could actually serve as a pretty crucial life lesson for all parents. And it somewhat contradicts that media narrative that we do often hear about Richard Williams as being the quote unquote crazy tennis dad, the guy who just forces his kids into tennis. So while many people might have this portrait of him as being an intense, domineering figure, Serena's reflection throughout the book really shows that his approach was actually grounded in giving his daughters the freedom to choose their path, to kind of point them in the right direction. He wasn't pushing them to succeed at any cost, simply just give them the tools and the opportunity. But ultimately, he's allowing them to decide how they use him.
You're right, it definitely does contradict the media narrative, and one I think I'd had about Richard Williams. So jumping ahead, Rick Massey and the Williams family eventually moved to Pompano Beach in Florida, and interestingly, the courts were just too close to the house to where they lived, and I think this is a nice section we can reflect on. She says, I remember growing to hate the courts where we played because they were so close to our house. Up until this time, we'd get into the car and go wherever we were playing, but now the courts were basically right outside our door. I think that proximity contributed to this weird funk I fell into regarding tennis. No, my parents didn't put any pressure on me to play, but those courts in Pompano Beach certainly did. They were so right there. They were in your face. There was no getting away from them. A couple of years later, when Venus and I were building our first house, after we'd had our first taste of success on tour, we made a clear decision not to put a court in our backyards. We certainly had the room and we certainly had the money, but I think we looked subconsciously to build some distance in our lives between home and tennis. Greg, what do you take from this section? Perhaps it's about creating a separation between work and life?
You're right. This section really is about creating that essential separation between work and life. And it's interesting how, even though our parents didn't put pressure on it to play, just being so close to the courts started to feel suffocating. For me, I actually really consciously do this whenever when I'm moving into a new job and trying to decide where I live. I like to have a little bit of a buffer between wherever I'm living and wherever I'm working. And that allows me to just kind of either get prepared on the drive into work or to decompress a little bit from the drive away from work. But having that little separation between those two things means everything doesn't blend into one, and it's not just that continued existence of, always being in the same place, doing the same thing over and over again. When you have that space to step away, you're able to return, I think, with a little bit more focus and drive. It's almost like having a mental reset. And that, I think, helps you become more productive and more engaged when you transition between those two worlds, and you kind of find it a little bit easier to get back into that zone.
Yeah, really great takeaway. And it really did make me reflect on this section regarding Andre Agassi's experience, where his dad built a tennis court in their backyard, which meant he didn't have that separation from the sport that he perhaps needed, and he did resent it. In contrast, in episode 4, we heard how Dan Carter's dad built rugby posts in his backyard in New Zealand. And in episode 33, I might not have mentioned it in the episode itself, but Tony Hawk's dad built a full-scale ramp in Tony's backyard. And I think in both cases, Dan and Tony thrived with that integration of sport and home life. So I guess it really comes down to the individual and their personal relationship with the sport. What works for one athlete might not necessarily work for another. So, Greg, you might ask, when did tennis switch from being a fun family activity to an emphasis on training tennis champions?
When did tennis switch from being a fun family activity to emphasis on training champions?
Oh, what a great question. And that
Thank
leads
you.
us into this. I've thought about this a lot over the years, about when it became clear that our parents were training us to be tennis champions and not just tennis players, but I can never quite put my finger on it. About the best I can figure is it was always out there, the idea of us being the best of the best, but at the same time, it was kept from us until we could understand it and use it to our advantage. In the very beginning, tennis was about being together as a family and having fun. I wanted to be like my sisters, to do the same things they were doing, and to do them just as well. So I set my personal bar at their level. At the same time, I wanted the praise and admiration of my parents and to have them recognize my extra efforts. That's all it was about. But then at some point, it became about pushing ourselves to being the very best we could, which of course made some of our practice sessions a whole lot less fun. This much is clear, but what I've never been able to figure out is when each of those shifts took place. Mind you, they weren't sudden shifts. We transitioned from one phase to the next without us kids really noticing anything different, and I think that was part of Daddy's handiwork. I've talked to V about this, and she's like me. She can't say for sure when the goal to be the number one player in the world came about. I wish I could say when that switched on for us, but I can't. To listen to my parents, that was the goal all along. But when we started out, it wasn't a very realistic goal. Any more than it's realistic to expect your baby daughter to become the first female president of the United States. Still, nobody in my family can say for sure when the idea that one of us Williams sisters might become the number one tennis player in the world seemed within reach, when it went from a faint hope or an impossible dream to an attainable goal.
Duncan, it's clear from Serena's story that the transition from playing tennis for fun to training to be champions wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't this just flash of brilliant white light. It was a gradual shift, something that evolved as they developed their skills and as their parents saw the potential in them grow. It seems like at first tennis was about family and fun, but as they did progress, they unknowingly perhaps started to push towards that little bit of a higher standard, one that ultimately did eventually become about being the best. Yes, the goal of having tennis champions was always there, but just under the surface. It wasn't something that their parents explicitly pushed onto them, which I think is pretty good parenting. It's almost like their parents provided a quiet, just sort of steady guiding hand, more gentle direction than malevolent manipulation.
Well, their dad kept them from pro tournaments as long as he could. I think there was some handy reverse psychology in there, but eventually Venus quote unquote convinced him to let her play. And in November 1994, after just turning 14, Venus made her professional debut at the Bank of West Classic in Oakland, California. She won her first round match against Sean Stafford, who was the 58th ranked player in the world, which is wild. She's the 14-year-old and she beat the 58th ranked player in the world. She won $5,350 in prize money, and the dad, to his credit, let them keep all the money from the very start.
Nice.
Yeah. So that's a lot of money for a 14 year
it's
old.
it's better than Tony Hawk's 80, what was it, $86 a month or 83 cents or what was
I
it?
think it was, yeah, 86 cents for his first month as a pro. For Serena, interestingly, the WTA were actually changing the rules around age eligibility in 1995 to 16 years old, and she was 14 at the time. And as well, they were introducing other restrictions. However, if Serena played one pro tournament before the rule change, she'd be grandfathered in under the old rules. Therefore, it made sense for her to play at least one pro tournament, which would quote unquote establish her eligibility.
So they didn't play any junior tournaments before she played pro tournaments?
They talked about under 10s. I don't think they played anything after that.
Like nothing, I don't want to, mock the under 10s, but anything meaningful that just jumped straight into the pros?
No, I believe under 10s and under 12s for Venus, and that was it. And they never played them in the same age category, so they wouldn't play each other.
Well, that's wild.
That was it. So Serena's first pro tournament was in Quebec City in November 1995, and she lost 6-1, 6-1.
Yeah, I can kind of understand why, to be perfectly honest.
So Serena reflects, on another day, under other circumstances, I could have beaten her, no question. But I think the moment was a little too big for my 14-year-old self. It messed with my head to be playing in front of a great big crowd underneath these great big expectations. Okay, so I wasn't ready. The powers that be at the WTA were right, I guess. Daddy was right, I guess. but I filed the experience away and vowed to learn from it. Even at 14, I knew there was an important takeaway inside this moment. For me, it was just that you can't take anything for granted. Playing those little kid events out in California, I'd always expected to win, and I usually did. I think I lost just 2 or 3 matches in my little kid career. Here, though, I could no longer expect to win. I'd have to earn it, fight for it, and I'd have to do it by myself.
So this is starting to make sense here, Duncan. It sounds like a very powerful moment in Serena's journey, and it speaks to the reality of stepping into the stepping into the big leagues, particularly after almost stepping over the minor leagues, I guess we could perhaps call that. But instead of letting this defeat define her, I love that she's seen it as a really critical learning experience. So even at that young age, she's recognized the importance of earning that success rather than simply just expecting it, like she did in the little kid career, as it's well put. I think it's a lesson that really can apply to anyone, regardless of age. Sometimes you do have to step out of that comfort zone and realize what worked before might not always work in new, tougher, more difficult situations. The key is to learn from those moments and use them to grow stronger. There is nothing wrong with stretching yourself here.
And a wild footnote that I'll add, Serena says that Venus never lost a junior match to anybody. I don't know how true that is, but that's Serena's recollection that Venus never lost. And she says she might have lost 2 or 3 times, but Venus didn't.
I
So,
wonder if that's like a Hicks and Gracie where he fought a million fights and never actually lost anyone.
yeah. But you're right, Greg. We've seen this kind of time and time again with some of our performers that we've covered that when they step up a level, they've immediately been humbled to some degree. I believe that Lance Armstrong, I think that was episode 22, he finished dead last in his first pro cycle event in Europe. I remember Bubba Watson didn't make his college team at the University of Georgia. Drew Brees was a backup in the NFL for his first 2 seasons. And as we heard in that last episode, episode 33 with Tony Hawk, when he turned pro at 14, he really struggled early in his career. So stepping up, it doesn't make it any easier, even if you end up being one of the world's best. Where you start has no impact on where you'll actually end up. So as I've said, her pro debut was in 1995, but she didn't play another pro event until 1997, which is at Indian Wells. So crazy to think that Indian Wells, which is a Master Series event, which is 1 tier shy of Grand Slams, was her second pro event.
What did they call that? Was that Operation Out of the Frying Pan?
Anyway, in 1998, Serena wins her first pro title in doubles, not singles, at the age of 16. For perspective, at that time, Venus was 17 and Venus had already made it to Wimbledon, the French Open, Australian Open. Venus at 17 had made it to the US Open finals and she was only ranked 66 in the world at the time before losing to Martina Hingis in straight sets. So it's safe to say that Venus at this stage of their careers is just way ahead of Serena. But Serena is actually starting to feel more and more comfortable, and she says, very quickly, I went from being alone and untethered out on the court to feeling empowered when I was playing singles. I went from being a little overwhelmed and out of place to believing I was untouchable, unstoppable, all in the space of just a few tournaments. I had a lot of growing up to do at the time. I had to grow my game. That was part of it, but I also had to grow my mindset to where I could withstand the pressures of tournament play. Pressure comes in all shapes and sizes. It means different things to different people. A lot of tennis players growing up on the junior circuit, it means pleasing their parents and coaches and justifying the time and expense of flying all over the place just so they can compete. For others, it means worrying constantly about what they're eating, how hard they're training, what they're giving up by focusing so single-mindedly on the game. For me, it's about the never-ending pursuit of perfection and making room for the realization that I might never get my game exactly where I want it to be, meaning I'd never be firing on all cylinders at precisely the right time. Greg, it feels like Serena's slowly coming out of the shadow of Venus here and really forging her own identity.
This is a pivotal moment for Serena. Up until now, I think she has always been in Venus's shadow, both literally and figuratively. Venus has already achieved so much at such a young age, that's unquestioned. And I think Serena is still sort of finding her way a little bit. But here you can really see Serena starting to come into her own, not just as a tennis player, but as an individual. She's gaining that confidence, becoming more comfortable in her own skin, and beginning to embrace her potential, not as maybe Venus's younger sister, just as Serena Williams. So I think what's really interesting about how she reflects on the pressures that come along with all of this and with competition, she talks about the pursuit of perfection and the realization that things won't always align to the way that she expects them to be. This is a massive moment of maturity for her, recognizing that it isn't just always about raw skill. It is about managing the mental side of the game too. She's no longer, as I said, just Venus's younger sister. She is beginning to define herself not just in tennis, but as a person. And that shift is critical to her success as she moves forward.
You're right, Greg. And with this new sense of identity, Serena begins to really tap into other aspects of herself that were previously, what I'd say, is under the surface. And she says, I like to look my best on court. I believe it's important. It goes to self-esteem, and at the same time, it ignites an all-important spark for some of that silent fuel I like to talk about. It also gets me thinking how we sometimes draw strength in areas we never think to look. In my case, I'm an athlete. I'm meant to draw strength from the weight room, from my iron will, from the sheer force of my game. But here I am, fussing over how I look, thinking that this too will make a difference. Face it, if you carry a positive picture of yourself, you'll present a positive picture to everyone else. If you put your best effort into how you look, you'll put your best effort into whatever it is you do. Personally, I always felt that when there was an edge to how I looked, there was an edge to my game. Eccentric, daring, fun, adventurous. Call it whatever you want, but very quickly I developed my own flair, which in turn was helped along by a couple of welcome developments off the court. The first was a sponsorship deal with Puma, which gave me license to be out there and be bold and really, really distinctive in what I wore when I played. After Puma, there was Nike, another sportswear company that was willing to push the envelope and let my personality shine through in what I wore. The second was a course of study I started to take at the Art Institute of Fort Lauderdale in design and fashion.
Duncan, let me jump in here because I think the lesson's clear and powerful. How you present yourself, whether that's through your appearance or through your style, that can impact your confidence and your performance. So it's all about being intentional. You know, there's that famous quote, I think it's Deion Sanders, look good, feel good, play good.
So what's your style saying about you tonight?
Comfy. I mean, the non-PC answer is doesn't give a fuck, but we'll go with comfy.
Well, on that note, we're going to jump ahead a little bit here to the French Open in 2002. Both Serena and Venus are in opposite semi-final matches. If they both win, Venus will become the number one player in the world. And with a French Open title, Serena would be the number two player in the world. And she says, all along, back as far as I could remember, Daddy used to talk about how he was raising the two best tennis players in the world in me and Venus. It was drummed into us from the very beginning, like it was our shared destiny, and Venus had reached the number one spot for the first time. This was huge, of course. Huge for Venus, huge for the family, just plain huge. But underneath the sheer bigness of the moment was more of that silent fuel that kept me going throughout my career. I'd always wanted what Venus had, so right away it set in motion this whole other piece of motivation, which rang alongside this weird revenge mojo piece regarding so-and-so. Greg, I'll get to so-and-so in a minute. I wanted desperately to taste what Venus now had. Once again, she was first and foremost in our family. First to the top. First among equals. First. Once again, I was little sister clipping at Venus's heels. You better believe it. Venus's success was a powerful motivator for me. Certainly as powerful as anything that was going on with me and my ex-boyfriend. Greg, that's so-and-so, and we'll get to so-and-so in a minute. So to the match itself, Greg, and Serena says, as it played out, I managed a straight sets victory over Venus to win the tournament 7-5, 6-3. I wish I could focus here on the mixed emotions I surely felt in beating my sister in a major final. But the triumph wasn't about that at the time. It really wasn't. It was about cementing our legacy as a family. It was a win-win for all of us. Venus was still number one. She got to feel like the true champion she was, and I won the French Open, so I got to feel like a champion too. Pretty great, huh? I still remember Venus taking pictures of me holding the French Open trophy. Greg, they did it. The sisters are holding the number one and number two spots in the world. I think we've probably taken their success for granted over time, but when you really stop and reflect on it, it's really ridiculous. It's hard to believe to have the two best female tennis players in the world come from the same family. It's nothing short of extraordinary.
Couldn't agree more. It's easy to overlook just how remarkable that achievement is when we've watched them dominate that sport for so long. But when you do step back, you realise how rare and monumental that actually is. There's obviously examples of successful siblings, but I don't think to this degree. Obviously, you've got Eli and Peyton Manning. They're right up there, both winning the Super Bowl multiple times. The Klitschko brothers were both world heavyweight boxing champions. You've got Mark and Steve Waugh, long-time cricket and legends in Australia. Currently, there's Nelly and Jessica Korda on the LPGA and their brother Sebi, who's a top 25 tennis player, which is a wildly successful family. And maybe Bobby and Jack Charlton, England football legends, but it's very difficult to put any of them above Venus and Serena in terms of total career success.
Yeah, those are some great ones. I'm sure we're missing a few, and feel free to send us a note or to leave a comment. Okay, so circling back to so and so, that was the ex-boyfriend. Serena goes into a lot more detail about this in the book, but to summarize, she'd been rumored to be dating NFL player Keyshawn Johnson. She refuses to use his name in the book, but I did a bit of investigative journalism, and that's who it was. Serena says that she was in love with him, and then one day he just stopped returning her calls.
Ghosted, I think, is the word that you're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely
Oh,
ghosted.
by the way, we're not going to get sued for slander here. When you talk about your own investigative journalism, this doesn't fill me with a lot of confidence.
I just chat GPT'd it.
Okay. So it's I think legally we're on ironclad solid ground here.
Well, Keyshawn, if you're listening and it's not you, please let us know.
Yeah, please leave a review as well.
Okay. So anyway, Serena was pissed about this and was using it as motivation. And she says, it was such a Williams family moment getting to 1-2 in the world. So much so that I nearly forgot about so-and-so, the way he had treated me. But nearly doesn't quite get you all the way there, does it? Deep down, I guess I was still in revenge mode. Still fixed on showing this guy what he'd missed and reminding him how badly he'd treated me. No, it's not the healthiest approach to the game, but in fairness to me, it was laid in with other, more positive takes. And now I can look back on it and think, hey, whatever works, right? Healthy or not, my twisted little payback mindset was certainly working, and it kept on working. It worked in Wimbledon, where I beat Venus again in the finals and earned my first number one ranking, which I held for a thrilling 57 weeks. That win knocked Venus into the number two spot, so the Williams sisters were still on top, only the other way around. It worked at the US Open back in New York, where as fate would have it, I powered past Venus again in the final round matchup. And it worked in Melbourne the following January, more than another year after the guy dumped me and sent me on this career-stamping momentum run. Once again, it took me beating Venus in the finals. 4 Grand Slam tournaments in a row, each on the back of an unfortunate piece of rejection and dejection, and each a reminder that it's about picking ourselves up and dusting ourselves off and pushing ourselves forward that we find our will, our drive, our purpose. Greg, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
Yeah, fucking watch out. It certainly seems like you don't want to get on the other side of the net when Serena's been dumped. I've heard the saying chips on shoulders equals chips in pockets, and she certainly earned some chips with 4 Grand Slams in a row. That's wild. And I guess I've never really thought about it, but revenge can be a powerful motivator. I'm not actually sure Keyshawn Johnson was impacted negatively by her winning, but it seemed to make sense for her and fueled her going forward. So good for her.
Yeah, it was certainly a crazy run, and really after, she said, a difficult period for her personally. So jumping ahead to 2003, Serena has a major knee injury which required surgery, but more significantly on September 14th, 2003. Yatunde Price had gone out for a late dinner with friends, and afterwards, Greg, she drove to Compton with a man that she'd recently started seeing. Shortly after midnight, a confrontation occurred. Her companion got into an argument with someone, a gun was pulled, shots were fired into the SUV. There was obvious chaos, and Unfortunately, Yetunde was the one hit. She was not the target, according to police, but it didn't matter. And she passed away instantly, leaving her three children behind. And obviously, a huge tragedy for Serena to lose one of her older sisters.
It's definitely a tragedy, and certainly reinforces her parents' instincts to get the girls out of Compton and move to Florida.
You're right. And of course, Serena is dealing with a lot at this stage. She's had a major injury. She's lost her sister. And coupled with that, she really loses her desire and motivation to play. She made her comeback in April of 2004 after 9 months out and even made it to the Wimbledon final in 2004 before falling to Maria Sharapova in straight sets 6-1, 6-4. Serena is actually still really struggling mentally during this period. And for the rest of 2004, it's kind of a wash. At the start of 2005, she actually wins the Australian Open, battling back to beat Lindsay Davenport in 3 sets, but it's somewhat papering over cracks. During this period, she's really depressed and has this sudden disinterest in the world around her. So she's really struggling, and this is kind of a reflection on this. And she says, heck, in the final 5 events I played in 2005, Rome, Wimbledon, Toronto, US Open, and Beijing, I didn't even make it to the quarterfinal round, so I was clearly hurting. I wasn't being honest with myself about how I was feeling, what I was thinking. In truth, I'd never been honest with myself about stuff like this, and that right there was the root of my troubles. People would ask me what was wrong and I'd shrug them off. I'd say everything was fine, but of course everything wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. Usually I could talk to my mom about something like this or my sisters, but I wouldn't let myself. Daddy too had always been a great sounding board, but I shut him out as well. I started seeing a therapist in Los Angeles during this period, weekly at first, then a couple of times a week, and I didn't even tell my mom about it. That's how closed off I was about whatever was going on with me. I wouldn't even leave my apartment except to go to therapy. In my therapy sessions, the more I talked, the more I started to realize that my gloomy funk had to do with making other people happy. It came up because of Tunde. It came up because of me not playing following my knee injury. It came up because of me wanting to validate the faith good people at Nike had placed in me with a big new sponsorship deal I'd signed when I was rehabbing my knee. It came up because of all those weeks at number one and the pressures I felt to get back there. It was all these things mashed up together, but the main ingredient was me trying to please everyone else.
Duncan, these struggles right here really, I think they highlight an important truth. Even the greatest of all time, they're not immune to the ups and downs of life. We often see these performers at the peak of their successes, but behind the scenes, there's so much more going on. She's reached the pinnacle of tennis, but that doesn't make her immune to deep personal struggles, to injuries, losses in motivation, pressures from outside expectations. Let's face it, just the mental toll of grief. It's a powerful reminder that greatness doesn't shield you from life's challenges, but at times it actually magnifies them. But it really is how you navigate those challenges that truly defines you.
So, Greg, her struggles continue for a while, and in Australia in 2006, her third round match against Daniela Hanchikova was where she was actually crying throughout the match and she was beaten in straight sets. And she says, I still remember walking to the players' locker room after the match feeling so completely lost and beaten and confused. I went back to Los Angeles as soon as I could and I didn't pick up a racket for months. Nothing was physically wrong with me. I was depressed, deeply and utterly and completely depressed. I didn't want to talk to anyone for weeks and weeks. I think I went about a month and a half without talking to my mum, which is so out of character for me because we usually spoke every day. It freaked her out, I'm sure. I didn't talk to my sisters and it freaked them out too. At one point, they came out to Los Angeles to shake me from my doldrums in a kind of intervention, and after that, I started seeing a therapist on a daily basis, so I guess it had a positive effect. I wasn't on any medication, although we talked about it in therapy, but I was leery of the changing moods or messing with my already fragile state of mind, so I resisted. Eventually, I came to the realization that I was the problem. It wasn't Nike or the pressure to be number one or being an emblem of hope for my family or any of that. It wasn't losing Tunde. These were all contributing factors, but ultimately it was on me. It was all this negative energy I'd allowed to build up around me. That's what was dragging me down. I couldn't even make myself happy, so of course there was no way I could make anyone else happy. All of a sudden, I looked up and felt like tennis didn't matter anymore. because it wasn't about tennis anymore. It was about playing and going through the motions and keeping all these people around me happy. I'd let the game get away from me. Greg, nobody does it alone. And here, Serena is finally reaching out and starts to work with a therapist.
Yes, and thank goodness. I think this moment really speaks to the power of just simply asking for help. It wasn't until her sisters intervened and she started to utilize the services of a therapist that she began to make progress. And it's a tough pill to swallow for someone who's always been so strong and has this very sort of explicitly strong public profile as well. But as I've mentioned, it shows that even the greatest performers, they need support just like anyone else. They are not tennis players, golfers, soccer players. They are people that play these sports, and it's always people at the forefront. So asking for help, it's not a sign of weakness. It really is a step towards healing. Serena's story, that is a reminder for me that mental health matters. And when you're struggling, reaching out to other people can be a first step in reclaiming your power and your purpose. Even if it's people that don't have specific training, just having that initial conversation is a great first step. And then recognizing when you do need that professional support, feeling comfortable in yourself to be able to go and extend that hand and reach out for it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but it's just so important to shed light on the fact that so many of our performers that we've covered have struggled with mental health issues and have sought help. There's strength in vulnerability, and by sharing these stories, I hope we can help in our own little way to break down some stigma around mental health. And one of the reflections I had, Greg, this was between really 2004 and 2006. She was really depressed almost over a 2 year period. And, that's 8 Grand Slams. Imagine if she didn't go through some of those challenges, what her record could have been like. It's kind of crazy that it almost took her out of the sport for 2 years. And through all this therapy, here are some of kind of Serena's conclusions. And she says, all along, going back to when I was a kid, I'd never made an active or conscious choice where tennis was concerned. It was always like tennis chose me. Don't get me wrong, I was honored to have been chosen, and I was blessed with a God-given gift, and I came to love the game, really and truly. But it had always been handed to me, and expected of me, and held out like a given. I came to it by default, and it took reaching for it here, when I was down and desperate and miserable, for me to fully embrace the game. I chose tennis at last. Greg, anything else that kind of stands out here?
A little bit. It's clear that at last she's reached a point where she's ready to choose tennis on her own terms, and that allows her to make a deliberate and very intentional commitment back to the sport. It was about reconciling with that true self and gaining that clarity around her identity, both as an athlete and, as I've mentioned, as a person.
So as I mentioned, Serena really didn't play much. She only played 4 tournaments in the whole of 2006 as she's going through her therapy. And as a result, she dropped to as low as 139 in the world. I just can't help but make the parallels to Agassi. Agassi dropped to a very similar figure. And she also admits that she's completely out of shape and gained over kind of 20 pounds of weight. So Serena Williams, and she calls it version 2.0, jumps into gear at the 2007 Australian Open, where she's getting criticism in the press for being overweight. And of course, the press can be incredibly cruel, but they don't know particularly about her mental health issues. And she says, on the body image front, I'd always been comfortable as an adult with how I looked. I'm big and athletic, so I know I'm never going to have one of those real thin supermodel type bodies. I'm not some blonde, blue-eyed thing. I have big boobs and I have a big butt. That's me and I love it. But from time to time, like most women, I stress about my appearance. I don't want to, but I do. I know better, but I do. I look in the mirror and everything seems too big, too much, too fat, too. Most times I see my reflection and what I get back is hot and sexy and all that good stuff. But I have my low moments, same as everyone else. I have my worry spots, and here in Australia, carrying all that extra weight, I had more than my share. So it wasn't easy to laugh off these hurtful comments as it might have been at some other time in my career. I was coming off that long layoff, and the mean-spirited comments about my fitness and my game were rooted in truth. I was a little heavy, maybe 20 pounds heavier than I wanted to be at that point.
Duncan, I think it's fascinating how, while she's grappling with this inner turmoil and the identity challenges that come along with it, she's also facing external criticism from the press about her body image. Again, it's a powerful example of how personal struggles often intersect with public perception, even when the public don't know what's going on in the background, and how even the most accomplished individuals, they're not immune to the pressures of the expectations that society puts on them.
And with all this going on in the background, she really talks about taking this tournament. It's the Australian Open, taking it round by round. She's getting stronger as it progresses. And eventually she meets Sharapova in the final. And this is what she shares. She says, the real push came from taking all those negatives and mashing them together into a great big positive. I put it in my head that I would not be beaten down by my critics, by my peers, by my sponsors, by my opponents. Together, it became my silent fuel. I would not be dismissed. I would dominate Paul Maria Sharapova, and indeed, that's just how it played out. With me on top by a convincing score of 6-1, 6-2, I would prove everyone wrong, and in doing so, I would prove something to myself, that I was back where I belonged, playing tennis at a high level, fighting for Grand Slam tournament titles, making my mark. I was determined to win, but not for those jerks at the newspaper who called me a cow. Not for all those sports writers who said I had no shot. Not for those sponsors who wanted nothing to do with me. No, I would do it for me. For the first time in my career, it hit me. That's why I was playing after all. The best part of my surprise performance in Melbourne, it set me up for the next phase of my career. It was as if I was born again as a player, like I'd put myself in a position once again to compete. I'm a work in progress, just like everyone else. What moves me one day might not move me the next. What helped shape me as a child might not make a dent in my thinking now. It's all relative. And yet, when you've done the bulk of your growing up in the public eye, as I have done, people seem to want to know a little more about you than you understand about yourself. One of the questions I'm asked all the time by reporters and fans is how I want to be remembered at the end of my tennis career, and I can never come up with a satisfying answer. Honestly, I'm not even sure I want to be remembered as a tennis player. When my body tells me it's time to stop chasing and smashing tennis balls for a living, I'll go on and do something else. You can be sure, and maybe I'll do something else that helps me leave my true mark. Maybe tennis is just a way for me to get from where I was to where I'm going. And yet the question keeps coming, more and more, as I continue to play and start to threaten or establish some all-time records in the women's game. How do I want to be remembered after all? I'll just have to get back to you on that one. And that is where we'll leave it. But as always, what are your top 10 life lessons from On the Line by Serena Williams?
Here are my top 10 life lessons from On the Line by Serena Williams. Number 1, embrace your unique journey. Your path doesn't need to look like anyone else's to be valid. Serena's early days in tennis weren't glamorous, but her family made it work, even on a budget. Speaking of her mother, she says, it wasn't just that she supported my dad's vision, she saw what he saw. She wanted what he wanted. Number 2, fuel yourself with doubt. Use negativity as motivation. Serena used the criticism and skepticism of others as fuel to prove them wrong. She says, I promised myself I'd never forget that article. I turned it into some more of that silent fuel. Number 3, it's about the long game. Focus on the process, not immediate results. Serena's childhood training was rooted in patience, allowing her the time to develop at her own pace. Number 4, mental strength is key. Resilience often comes from within, even after major setbacks. Serena was able to turn failures into triumphs. She says, I had a lot of growing up to do in that time. I had to grow my game. That was part of it. But I also had to grow my mindset. Number 5, lean into your support system. A strong support network can propel you forward. Serena's family, especially Venus, was instrumental in shaping her career. She says, Venus's success was a powerful motivator for me, certainly as powerful as anything that was going on with me. Number 6, adapt to your own needs. Make decisions based on your own growth, not external pressure. Serena's father kept them off the junior circuit to avoid unnecessary pressures. She says, Daddy didn't like the way parents and coaches were all over their junior players. He wanted us to have a normal life. Number 7, embrace challenges as opportunities. Challenges are opportunities for growth. Despite immense pressure, Serena used moments of doubt to find her inner drive. She says, once I realised the outcome of this match was out of my hands, it was like a switch flipped. Number 8, be true to yourself. Authenticity matters. Serena's distinctive style, both on and off the court, was essential in shaping her career. She says if you carry a positive picture of yourself, you'll present a positive picture to everyone else. Number 9, resilience is rooted in discipline. Staying disciplined through tough times builds resilience. Serena's focus on discipline in tennis was passed down from her parents, instilling habits for life. She says, Daddy carved out some special time for each of us. Underneath our hectic comings and goings, he talked to us a lot about focus and discipline. And finally, number 10, growth is constant. Even the most successful people are still works in progress. Serena acknowledged her flaws, learned from them, and continually worked on herself. She says, I am a work in progress, just like everyone else.
Greg, another fantastic top 10, but as always, there are lessons to avoid from Serena's story on the line. So, what are your top 10 lessons to avoid?
My top 10 behaviors to avoid from Serena Williams on the line. Number 1, letting others define you. Don't let the opinions of others dictate your worth or your journey. She says, people always ask about my tennis memories, but I'm afraid I don't have one. I just remember playing all the time. Number 2, chasing perfection. Striving for perfection can lead to frustration. Accept that you'll never get everything exactly right, but still aim for excellence. She says, the pursuit of perfection, making room for the realization that I might never get my game exactly where I wanted to be. Number 3, avoiding difficult conversations. Bottling up emotions doesn't help. Serena struggled with being honest with herself and others about her challenges. She says, I didn't talk to anyone for weeks and weeks. I started seeing a therapist in Los Angeles during this period. Number 4, playing for others, not yourself. Success won't feel as fulfilling if it's all about pleasing others. Serena found true drive when she played for herself. She said, I would do it for me. For the first time in my career, it hit me. That's why I was playing after all. Number 5, ignoring mental health. Mental health is just as important as physical health. Serena struggles with depression, were a key part of her journey to rediscovering her love for tennis. She says, it was all this negative energy I'd allowed to build up around me. I couldn't even make myself happy. Number 6, relying on external validation. Seeking constant validation can undermine self-confidence. Serena had to find validation within herself rather than from external sources. She says, people would ask me what was wrong and I'd shrug them off. I wasn't honest with myself. Number 7, avoiding tough decisions. Sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect your well-being. Serena struggled with this, especially around her training and self-care. She says, I didn't talk to my mom about it. That's how closed off I was about whatever was going on with me. Number 8, letting pressure consume you. Unchecked pressure can lead to burnout. Serena had to learn how to cope with the expectations placed on her, both by herself and others. Number 9, holding on to negative energy. Letting negativity linger can weigh you down. Serena had to learn to release her negative feelings to move forward. She says, it wasn't Nike or the pressure to be number 1. It wasn't losing Tunde. These were all contributing factors, but ultimately, it was on me. And finally, number 10, shying away from self-care. Prioritize self-care, including mental health. Serena's struggle with acknowledging her emotional needs held her back at certain points in her career. She says, I wouldn't leave my apartment except to go to therapy. Thank you so much for joining myself and Duncan on this episode. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with someone that you know, and it will help us to grow the show and keep doing what we're doing. Also, if you get a moment, pop over to your platform, leave us a 5-star rating and a short review, and we will see you next time on Performers.